When a side hustle fails, the explanation that gets offered is almost always about the idea. The market wasn't there. The timing was wrong. The competition was too established. The concept didn't resonate. These explanations are rarely wrong, but they're rarely the full story. Because most side hustle failures aren't caused by bad ideas. They're caused by structural problems that were present from the beginning, that would have been visible to someone examining the structure rather than just the concept. The structural failure points that end most side hustles in year one fall into three categories: undercapitalization, wrong pricing, quitting too early. Each of these is structural. Each of them compounds, and each of them is more predictable and more preventable than the idea-based explanation most people reach for after the fact. Undercapitalization is the most common. Not the most discussed, but the most common. Most side hustles require time to generate income, time to build an audience, time to develop credibility, time to close the first client, time to iterate toward what the market actually responds to. And most side hustle owners who started without examining the runway run out of that time before they reach the point where the hustle would have worked. Not because the hustle was wrong, because the financial and temporal runway was too short to reach the validation point. Wrong pricing compounds differently. Pricing decisions made in the early stage don't just affect early revenue. They establish the market's perception of what the hustle is worth. A hustle priced too low attracts price-sensitive clients who are the hardest to retain, the most demanding relative to the revenue they generate, and the most resistant to price increases later. A hustle priced too low also signals low value to the market, making it harder to raise prices later without losing the client base built at the lower price. The early pricing decision shapes the trajectory of the business far beyond the first few months it takes effect. Quitting too early is the failure point most people never see coming. Because from the inside, at the moment of quitting, it doesn't feel like quitting too early. It feels like making the rational decision based on the available evidence. The evidence says months of effort, limited results, no clear sign that this is about to change. What the evidence doesn't show, because it hasn't happened yet, is the inflection point that was approaching, the moment where the audience would have reached critical mass, where the next client would have come from a referral rather than cold outreach, where the process would have clicked into something that started to work reliably. Most hustles that get abandoned in year one weren't bad ideas. They were abandoned before the compounding had time to produce the evidence that would have justified continuing. A side hustle requires runway. Not just financial runway, though that matters. Temporal runway. The time available to reach the point where the hustle generates enough to sustain continued operation. And most side hustle owners underestimate how much runway is required and start without enough of either. The timeline of a typical side hustle doesn't match most people's expectations. Month 1. The hustle is started, infrastructure built, offering defined, first outreach made. Month 2. First potential clients identified, first conversations had, first rejections received. Month 3. Maybe a first client, maybe not yet. Iteration happening, the offering being refined based on what the market is actually responding to. Month 6. A clearer picture, repeat clients or consistent new ones, the process starting to develop muscle memory, the results starting to look like something. Month 12. The hustle has a track record, some credibility, some proof that the model works, a foundation to build from. Most people who start side hustles expect results in month 1 or 2, not month 12. Which means when month 3 arrives and the results don't match the expectation, The response is to question the idea, not the timeline. Was this the wrong concept? Is the market not there? Should I try something different? And the hustle gets abandoned, or pivoted away from, at month 3 or 4, before it had the time it needed to reach the point where it would have worked. The financial dimension of undercapitalization compounds the temporal one. A side hustle that requires investment in tools, in advertising, in infrastructure needs capital to operate before it generates capital. Most side hustle owners either underestimate these costs or have no clear plan for how to fund the early stage, which means when unexpected costs arrive, a tool more expensive than anticipated, an advertising test that didn't convert, the financial pressure compounds the psychological pressure of slow early results. And the combination, financial strain plus slow results, produces the rational feeling decision to quit that is structurally premature. The solution isn't complicated, but it requires a decision before the hustle starts, not after it's struggling. Define the runway. How long will I give this before making a judgment about its viability? Define the capital. What does it cost to operate during that runway period? Is that capital available? Define the validation criteria. What would I need to see, at what point, to conclude the idea isn't working versus conclude the timeline hasn't been honored? These questions don't guarantee success, but they replace the emotional decision made under pressure, the month 4 abandonment of something that needed month 12, with a structural commitment made in clarity. And structural commitments made in clarity produce better decisions than emotional ones made under strain.
If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video, subscribe. More clarity is coming. Pricing is one of the most consequential decisions in the early stage of a side hustle, and one of the most commonly gotten wrong. Not because the math is complicated, because the psychology of pricing in an early stage, when there's no track record, no social proof, no existing client base, pushes almost everyone toward a price lower than the one they should set. The underpricing instinct comes from a specific fear. If I charge what I think it's worth, nobody will pay. If I charge less, at least I'll get clients. At least I'll start generating revenue. At least I'll have something to build from. This logic isn't irrational. In the very earliest stage, before there's any validation, getting the first client matters more than getting the right price. But the underpricing instinct persists well past the point where it's appropriate. It becomes the default, not a temporary early-stage choice, and it creates structural problems that compound forward. The first structural problem is client quality. Low pricing attracts price-sensitive clients. Price-sensitive clients are the most demanding relative to the revenue they generate. They negotiate harder. They scope creep more. They're more likely to request revisions. They're more likely to churn when a cheaper option appears. A client base built at low prices is a client base that maximizes the owner's workload while minimizing the margin available to invest in improvement and growth. The hustle becomes busier with the wrong clients, leaving less capacity to develop the product, improve the process, or attract better ones. The second structural problem is market signaling. Price is information. It signals to the market what the hustle believes it's worth, what category it belongs to, what kind of client it's designed to serve. A low price signals a low-value option, not necessarily intentionally, but consistently, because buyers use price as a proxy for quality when they don't have other information.
The hustle priced low is competing on price against every other low-priced option in the category. The hustle priced higher, with credible positioning to support the price, is competing on value against a smaller, less price-sensitive market that is easier to retain and more likely to refer. Raising prices later is harder than setting them right earlier. A client base accustomed to low prices will resist an increase. Some will leave. The transition period is uncomfortable and often generates the kind of short-term revenue loss that feels like confirmation the higher price was wrong. It usually isn't. The client loss is often the loss of the clients who were costing more to serve than they were worth. But the psychological pressure of watching clients leave during a price increase, especially in the early stage, pushes many hustle owners back to the lower price, which locks them into the margin, the client profile, and the market positioning of the underpriced model. The early pricing decision wasn't just about early revenue. It was a structural decision about what the hustle would become and whether it would ever be viable at the margins required to sustain it. There's a specific moment in the timeline of most side hustles that isn't visible on any graph. It doesn't show up in the revenue numbers. It doesn't appear in the client count. It isn't marked by any external signal. But it exists. The inflection point. The moment where the compounding that has been building invisibly would have started to become visible if the hustle had continued past it. Compounding in a side hustle works the same way it works in a portfolio. The early returns are small, almost invisible relative to the effort invested. The content published doesn't get much traction. The outreach generates few responses. The early clients don't refer consistently. The reputation being built doesn't feel like it's building. This is normal, not a signal that something is wrong, not evidence that the idea doesn't work. It's the early stage of compounding, where the inputs are real and the outputs are small, because the base hasn't built enough yet to produce the returns that will eventually justify the inputs. The problem is that the early stage looks identical to failure. From the inside, at month 4 or month 6, the experience of a hustle that is compounding towards something is the same as the experience of one that isn't. Slow results, inconsistent income, more effort than output, uncertainty about whether this is going to work. And the natural response to that experience, the rational feeling response, is to conclude that it isn't working and to stop, which is precisely what most people do, at precisely the moment where the compounding would have started to become visible. The people who build successful side hustles aren't usually the ones who figured it out faster. They're the ones who stayed in it longer, who honored the runway they'd committed to, who continued when the results didn't justify the effort by month 4, who treated the early stage as what it structurally was, an investment period, rather than as evidence of failure. Not because they were more disciplined, because they had a framework that distinguished between a hustle that isn't working and a hustle that hasn't had time to compound. Those are different things, and treating them as the same thing is the most common cause of year 1 abandonment of something that would have worked. The framework for knowing the difference isn't complicated. Is the market responding at all, even modestly, even inconsistently? Are the early clients satisfied with what they received? Is the process improving? Is each delivery better than the last? Is there evidence, however small, that the audience is growing, the credibility is accumulating, the referrals are starting to happen? If the answers are yes, even partially, the hustle is compounding, slowly, in the early stage, producing returns that don't yet match the inputs. That's not failure. That's the early stage of something that takes time to build. And the hustle owner who understands that distinction, who stays through the early stage that looks like failure, is the one who reaches the inflection point that most people quit just before. If you've been sitting with something wondering whether to keep going, subscribe and like this if it clarified something.